It began with a routine review that should have passed unnoticed inside the walls of a royal charity office. But when Princess Anne quietly requested access to a series of financial reports connected to Queen Camilla's flagship foundation, everything changed. What started as a simple audit soon triggered panic behind palace doors. Within days, confidential records were circulating among senior advisors, and whispers of financial irregularities threatened to ignite one of the biggest royal scandals in years. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. At first, very few people paid attention to Anne's request. After all, the Princess Royal had built her reputation on discipline, duty, and relentless attention to detail. She was known for asking difficult questions and expecting clear answers. Yet something about this particular review felt different. Palace insiders reportedly noticed a sudden shift in tone among senior administrators almost immediately after the records were submitted for examination. Meetings that were expected to last an hour stretched late into the evening. Legal advisors were quietly brought into discussions. Senior staff, who normally spoke freely about charitable operations, suddenly became cautious with every word they chose. As days passed, concern slowly transformed into alarm. According to reports circulating among royal circles, several palace advisors reviewing the documents discovered figures that they believed required closer scrutiny. Nobody was publicly accusing anyone of wrongdoing, but the atmosphere inside royal offices reportedly grew tense. Questions began surfacing about spending practices, oversight procedures, and whether every financial decision had received the level of review expected from an organization carrying royal prestige. What should have been a routine administrative process was beginning to resemble something far more serious. Meanwhile, Queen Camilla's team allegedly found themselves facing increasing pressure. Sources claimed that staff members were scrambling to understand why the review had suddenly attracted so much attention. Some reportedly believed the concerns would disappear after a few clarifications. Others feared the situation was already spiraling beyond their control. The more questions that emerged, the more difficult it became to provide simple answers. And in royal circles, uncertainty often creates its own dangerous momentum. Then came the emergency meetings. Royal administrators, legal experts, and trusted advisors were reportedly summoned to discuss the growing concerns. While the details of those conversations remain closely guarded, insiders claimed the discussions focused on accountability, transparency, and the potential consequences if troubling findings continued to emerge. Every new meeting seemed to generate even more questions. Every answer appeared to uncover another layer beneath the surface. Soon, copies of financial records were reportedly being reviewed by an increasingly small circle of influential figures. The documents themselves became the subject of intense speculation. Some believed the concerns would ultimately prove harmless. Others whispered that the review might expose deeper problems that had remained hidden for years. The uncertainty fueled rumors across royal networks, and before long, talk of a possible intervention from senior members of the family began spreading quietly through palace corridors. What made the situation even more unsettling was Princess Anne's silence. She offered no public comment, no reassurance, no indication of what she had found or what actions might follow. Yet those who had watched her operate over the years understood one thing clearly. Anne rarely moved without purpose, and when she committed herself to a matter involving the integrity of the institution, she was not known for backing down. As speculation intensified and pressure mounted behind closed doors, many began to suspect that this review was no longer about a charity foundation alone. It was becoming a test of trust, accountability, and power at the highest levels of the monarchy, setting the stage for revelations far bigger than anyone had initially imagined. But the troubling figures hidden inside those reports were only the beginning, and what investigators allegedly uncovered next would send shockwaves through the monarchy. The documents were not supposed to leave the foundation's inner circle, yet somehow, detailed financial summaries and expenditure records found their way into the sons of palace officials, exposing transactions that immediately raised questions. As word of the leaked records quietly spread through royal circles, the atmosphere surrounding the foundation changed almost overnight. What had begun as a routine review was now evolving into something far more serious, something that carried the potential to shake public confidence and place some of the monarchy's most trusted figures under an uncomfortable spotlight. The documents reportedly contained detailed breakdowns of expenditures, allocations, and internal financial movements that had never been intended for outside examination. At first glance, some of the figures appeared ordinary, but according to insiders, the deeper auditors looked, the more difficult it became to ignore patterns that seemed inconsistent with the foundation's stated objectives. Questions began emerging around spending decisions that reportedly lacked clear explanations. Certain transactions appeared to move through administrative channels without the level of documentation normally expected for an organization operating under royal patronage. No one publicly claimed wrongdoing, but uncertainty itself became a powerful force. Every unexplained figure generated another question. Every question led investigators toward another document, and every new discovery seemed to deepen the mystery rather than resolve it. The review team reportedly started comparing expenditures against the foundation's charitable goals, searching for answers that would either reassure concerned officials or justify the growing alarm. Instead, they allegedly found themselves trapped between conflicting explanations and incomplete records. Some expenditures reportedly appeared larger than expected. Others seemed disconnected from the projects they were supposedly supporting. While defenders of the foundation insisted there were reasonable explanations, critics quietly wondered why those explanations had not been clearly documented from the beginning. Inside palace offices, concern was no longer confined to a small group of reviewers. Senior officials reportedly began discussing the potential consequences if the controversy continued to grow. Transparency became the word repeated most often behind closed doors, not because anyone had reached a final conclusion, but because confidence in the foundation, if depended on public trust. And trust, once questioned, can be remarkably difficult to restore. The fear was no longer limited to what the records contained. The fear was becoming what the public might eventually think they contained. Meanwhile, donors reportedly started seeking clarification about how funds had been allocated. Some were said to be requesting additional information before committing future support. Others simply wanted reassurance that every contribution had been used exactly as intended. Their concerns added another layer of pressure to an already volatile situation. What had started as an internal review was now threatening to become a broader discussion about accountability, responsibility, and whether proper oversight had always been maintained. Outside the palace, media insiders began hearing whispers of a developing financial controversy. Journalists reportedly received fragments of information from multiple sources, each story painting a slightly different picture, but pointing toward the same troubling possibility. Something significant was happening behind the scenes. The challenge was determining exactly what. Speculation intensified with every passing day. Rumors spread faster than facts. Headlines seemed ready to emerge at any moment. As public curiosity grew, so did demands for a comprehensive review. Voices both inside and outside royal circles reportedly argued that only a full examination could answer the questions now hanging over the foundation. What had once appeared to be a manageable administrative matter was transforming into a test of credibility itself. And as investigators continued digging through the records, another realization began to emerge. The mystery was no longer centered solely on the transactions. Increasingly, attention was turning toward the individuals who had authorized them, approved them, and allowed them to proceed without challenge. As scrutiny increased, attention shifted from the numbers themselves to the people who had approved them. Unlike others who reacted with shock, Princess Anne reportedly responded with something far more dangerous: silence. The harder she worked behind closed doors, the more nervous certain palace figures became. The growing controversy surrounding the foundation had already created unease throughout royal circles, but Anne's reaction transformed that unease into genuine anxiety. Those who knew her well understood that she was not the type to engage in public drama or emotional declarations. She rarely rushed to judgment, and she rarely revealed her thinking before reaching a conclusion. That was precisely why her silence carried such weight. While rumors swirled and speculation dominated private conversations, Anne reportedly withdrew deeper into the investigation, allowing the evidence to speak louder than any public statement ever could. According to palace insiders, what began as a financial review was now evolving into a discreet, internal inquiry with far broader implications. Trusted advisors were allegedly brought together to assist in examining years of records connected to the foundation's operations. Every expenditure, authorization, and administrative decision reportedly became subject to renewed scrutiny. The objective was no longer simply to explain a handful of unusual transactions. The objective had become understanding whether larger governance concerns had quietly developed beneath the surface over time. As the inquiry expanded, requests for documentation reportedly began reaching multiple departments across the royal administrative structure. Records were reviewed, archived communications revisited, and procedural approvals examined with increasing intensity. What made the process particularly unsettling for many involved was Anne's reputation itself. Throughout decades of royal service, she had developed a reputation for discipline, precision, and relentless commitment to duty. When she demanded answers, people understood that vague explanations would not satisfy her. Every question required evidence. Every claim required verification. That pressure soon reached foundation executives, who reportedly found themselves facing difficult conversations behind closed doors. Some were allegedly asked to clarify spending decisions made years earlier. Others were required to explain approval processes that had previously attracted little attention. While no formal accusations were publicly made, the atmosphere reportedly grew more uncomfortable with every passing day. Individuals who once felt confident in their decisions now found themselves revisiting old records and searching for answers to questions they never expected to face. Meanwhile, palace sources described an environment increasingly defined by tension. Conversations reportedly became shorter, trust became more fragile. Every new document reviewed seemed to create fresh uncertainty. Staff members who had once believed the controversy would fade away began realizing that the inquiry was moving in the opposite direction. Instead of narrowing, it was widening. Instead of settling concerns, it was uncovering new areas requiring examination. At the center of those concerns stood the issue of governance. Questions reportedly emerged regarding oversight procedures, approval structures, and whether existing safeguards had been sufficient to prevent confusion or mismanagement. What troubled some officials most was not necessarily any single transaction, but the possibility that broader weaknesses within the system had gone unnoticed for years. If that proved true, the consequences could extend far beyond one foundation or one controversy. As Anne continued her work, the pressure became impossible to ignore. Her determination gave the investigation a sense of momentum that few believed could be stopped. Yet even as the inquiry advanced, there remained a lingering belief among some palace figures that the worst had already been discovered. They assumed the financial records represented the heart of the controversy. They assumed the difficult questions were already on the table. But beneath the growing tension and mounting uncertainty, another layer of the story was quietly waiting to emerge, one that would challenge assumptions, deepen suspicions, and threaten to change everything investigators thought they understood. Yet even Anne may not have anticipated what a deeper examination would supposedly uncover. The deeper investigators looked, the larger the controversy appeared to become. What initially seemed like isolated accounting questions reportedly expanded into a network of decisions stretching back years. By this stage, the inquiry had moved far beyond the handful of transactions that first triggered concern. Investigators reportedly found themselves revisiting historical records that many assumed would never attract attention again. Files that had sat untouched for years were suddenly being examined with fresh eyes. Spending reports were cross-referenced against project objectives. Approval records were compared against internal procedures. The further the review progressed, the more it appeared that the story was not about a single decision or a single moment. It was about patterns, processes, and a chain of choices that stretched across multiple years. That realization changed everything. According to Palace insiders, investigators began re-examining historical spending records in an effort to understand how certain expenditures had been authorized and whether they aligned with the Foundation's stated mission. Some documents reportedly raised questions, not because they proved anything inappropriate, but because they seemed to reveal gaps in the decision-making process. Those gaps became increasingly difficult to ignore. Every unanswered question opened the door to another. Every inconsistency encouraged a deeper search. Soon, attention turned toward the authorization process itself. Who had approved specific expenditures? What oversight mechanisms had been in place? Had proper reviews been conducted before major decisions moved forward? These were not simple questions, and the answers reportedly varied depending on who was asked. Some officials maintained that procedures had been followed correctly. Others allegedly struggled to explain why certain approvals appeared incomplete, or why documentation was missing from records that should have been comprehensive. Then came another unexpected development. Additional documents reportedly began surfacing as the investigation widened. Some were said to contain correspondence linked to administrative decisions. Others allegedly provided context that investigators had not previously considered. None of the materials offered immediate clarity. Instead, they seemed to complicate the picture further, creating an even larger puzzle for most trying to understand exactly what had happened over the years. The controversy was no longer shrinking under scrutiny. It was growing. Behind the scenes, legal experts were reportedly consulted in increasing numbers. Their role was not necessarily to determine guilt or innocence, but to evaluate procedures, obligations, and potential risks. The very fact that legal specialists had become involved reportedly heightened concern throughout palace circles. For many observers, their presence suggested that the matter had evolved beyond routine administration. It was now being treated as a serious institutional issue with potentially significant consequences. As pressure mounted, Foundation leadership allegedly found themselves under unprecedented scrutiny. Executives who had once operated comfortably within established structures were now being asked to justify decisions made years earlier. Explanations that might have satisfied routine inquiries no longer seemed sufficient. Confidence was weakening. Patience was running thin. The burden of proving that everything had been handled appropriately grew heavier with every new discovery. Meanwhile, palace officials reportedly began worrying about something even larger than the investigation itself: reputational damage. The monarchy depends heavily on public trust, and trust can be fragile when questions remain unanswered. Even if no definitive wrongdoing were ultimately uncovered, the mere existence of prolonged uncertainty threatened to cast a shadow over everyone involved. The fear was not only about what investigators might find, it was about what the public might conclude before all the facts were known. That fear fueled an explosion of speculation. Rumors spread through royal circles, media networks, and donor communities. Some predicted sweeping reforms. Others whispered about resignations, suspensions, or dramatic interventions from senior members of the royal family. No one seemed certain where the inquiry would ultimately lead. Yet one thing had become impossible to deny. The controversy had evolved into something far larger than anyone anticipated when Anne first requested those records. And while investigators continued digging into the past, another question was quietly emerging in the background, a question that threatened the very survival of the Foundation itself. And while investigators focused on the past, the future of the Foundation itself suddenly came into question. For years, the Foundation had been closely associated with Camilla's public image. Now, that same connection threatened to become its greatest vulnerability. What once appeared to be one of the most stable elements of her public legacy was suddenly facing intense scrutiny from every direction. The investigation had already raised difficult questions, but now those questions were no longer confined to private meetings and confidential reviews. They were beginning to spill into the wider public conversation. The Foundation's name, once linked to charitable work and positive headlines, was increasingly being mentioned alongside words like transparency, accountability, and oversight. For those watching events unfold, the shift was dramatic. Success that had taken years to build seemed to be colliding headfirst with a controversy that grew larger with every passing day. Public scrutiny intensified rapidly. What began as isolated whispers among palace insiders evolved into a growing wave of curiosity and concern. People wanted answers. They wanted explanations. Most importantly, they wanted reassurance that the institution they supported remained worthy of their trust. Every new rumor seemed to fuel another. Every unanswered question encouraged further speculation. The pressure was no longer building quietly. It was becoming impossible to ignore. At the same time, donors reportedly began seeking direct reassurance regarding the foundation's operations. Many had supported its work for years, believing their contributions were helping important causes. Now, uncertainty was creating discomfort. Some allegedly requested additional clarification about how funds had been allocated. Others reportedly waited cautiously before making future commitments. The concern was not necessarily driven by proven misconduct, but by the growing sense that too many questions remained unresolved. In matters involving public trust, uncertainty can be almost as damaging as confirmed facts. Inside the foundation itself, leadership reportedly struggled to regain control of the narrative. Every effort to calm concerns seemed to be overtaken by new speculation. Explanations that might have ended the controversy weeks earlier now faced greater skepticism. The investigation had advanced too far. The questions had become too numerous. What had once looked like a temporary challenge was beginning to resemble a crisis of confidence. Meanwhile, royal aides found themselves engaged in increasingly urgent discussions about how to respond. According to insiders, opinions differed sharply behind closed doors. Some believed patience was necessary while the investigation continued. Others argued that waiting carried its own risks. Every day without clear answers appeared to strengthen public doubts. Every delay seemed to create additional opportunities for rumors to flourish. The challenge was no longer simply managing the investigation. The challenge had become managing the growing perception that the monarchy itself might be struggling to address the controversy. As this debate unfolded, media speculation reached extraordinary levels. Journalists, commentators, and royal observers reportedly competed to uncover details about what was happening behind palace walls. Stories circulated faster than officials could respond. Theories multiplied. Predictions became bolder. Some suggested sweeping reforms were inevitable. Others whispered that major figures could soon face difficult consequences. Whether accurate or not, the speculation added another layer of pressure to an already volatile situation. Camilla's supporters reportedly launched their own efforts to contain the damage. They emphasized the foundation's achievements, highlighted years of charitable work, and argued that conclusions should not be reached before the investigation was complete. Yet even their defense revealed a deeper truth. The situation had reached a point where damage control was necessary at all. That reality alone spoke volumes about how serious the controversy had become. With scrutiny intensifying, donors demanding reassurance, palace officials growing anxious, and public confidence hanging in the balance, pressure for decisive action mounted from every direction. The monarchy could no longer rely on silence to calm the storm. A decision was approaching, and according to those closest to the unfolding drama, the moment that would ultimately define the entire crisis was now only days away. Then came the meeting that many insiders would later describe as the turning point. The atmosphere inside the private meeting was reportedly tense from the very beginning. Senior royals, advisors, and legal experts gathered to discuss a future that only weeks earlier seemed unthinkable. By the time the meeting began, the controversy had already evolved far beyond a routine financial review. Months of questions, weeks of investigation, and days of escalating pressure had brought some of the monarchy's most influential figures to a moment of reckoning. According to insiders, everyone in attendance understood the stakes. The discussion was no longer focused solely on accounting records or governance procedures. It had become a conversation about trust, credibility, and the long-term reputation of an institution that depended heavily on public confidence. The decisions made inside that room would determine not only the future of the foundation, but also how the monarchy intended to respond when confronted by a growing crisis. Emergency consultations reportedly dominated the opening stages of the discussions. Legal experts presented their findings. Financial advisors outlined their concerns. Administrative officials summarized the results of weeks of document reviews and internal examinations. While accounts of the meeting vary, sources suggest that the information placed before those present painted a troubling picture, not necessarily because every question had been answered, but because too many questions remained unresolved. Uncertainty itself had become one of the greatest threats facing the institution. As recommendations were presented, attention reportedly shifted toward possible solutions. Some advisors allegedly argued for patience, suggesting additional reviews before any dramatic action was taken. Others warned that delay could prove costly. Public scrutiny was increasing. Donor confidence appeared increasingly fragile. Media speculation was growing more aggressive by the day. Every moment spent waiting carried the risk of further damaging public trust. The challenge was finding a response strong enough to restore confidence without appearing reckless or reactionary. Throughout these discussions, Princess Anne reportedly remained focused on two principles: accountability and transparency. According to those familiar with the meeting, she argued that the monarchy's credibility depended on its willingness to confront difficult situations directly. Avoiding uncomfortable questions might provide temporary relief, but it would not restore trust. Anne allegedly emphasized that public confidence had been earned over generations through responsibility and integrity. Once lost, rebuilding it could take years. Her position carried significant influence. After decades of service, her reputation for discipline and unwavering commitment to duty gave additional weight to every argument she made. As the debate continued, concerns about public trust reportedly became the dominant theme. Legal risks mattered, financial implications mattered, yet the larger issue was perception. Palace officials allegedly understood that the public was watching closely. Every decision would be interpreted as a reflection of the monarchy's values. The institution could not afford to appear indifferent, divided, or unwilling to address concerns openly. The pressure to demonstrate leadership was becoming overwhelming. Multiple options were reportedly considered throughout the discussions. Some proposals focused on restructuring oversight. Others involved temporary measures designed to reassure donors and stakeholders. More significant interventions were also allegedly placed on the table. While opinions differed on the details, a growing consensus reportedly began emerging around the belief that symbolic actions alone would no longer be sufficient. Something stronger was required, something decisive. Gradually, the mood inside the meeting shifted. What had begun as a debate evolved into preparation. Recommendations were refined. Final positions were clarified. Legal advisors reportedly worked alongside senior officials to outline potential next steps. By the end of the discussions, those present allegedly understood that a turning point had been reached. The crisis could no longer remain contained within palace walls. Decisions were being prepared that would carry consequences far beyond the foundation itself. And as the final recommendations took shape, a sense of inevitability reportedly settled over the proceedings. The investigation had led everyone to this moment. The questions, the scrutiny, the pressure, and the uncertainty had all been building toward a single outcome. What happened next would determine whether the controversy faded into history or exploded into one of the most talked about royal scandals in recent memory. What followed would transform the crisis from an internal concern into a full-scale royal controversy. When news of the foundation's alleged suspension began spreading, disbelief quickly turned into outrage. Few had expected events to move so quickly or so publicly. For weeks, the controversy had been growing behind closed doors, fueled by investigations, confidential reviews, and increasingly tense discussions among senior royal figures. Yet many still believed the situation would remain largely private, handled quietly through internal procedures and careful negotiations. That assumption collapsed the moment reports began circulating that the Foundation's rescience operations had allegedly been halted pending further review. What had once been a contained institutional problem instantly transformed into a public spectacle, and the reaction was explosive. The announcement sent shockwaves through royal circles. According to insiders, many individuals connected to the Foundation had expected reforms, recommendations, or additional oversight measures. Few anticipated a move that appeared so dramatic. The alleged suspension immediately became the center of attention, overshadowing nearly every other royal story. Suddenly, the Foundation itself was no longer merely part of the controversy. It had become the symbol of the controversy. Financial reviews that had once seemed technical and administrative now dominated public discussion. Every question that investigators had raised over previous weeks was revisited with renewed intensity. Commentators debated the significance of the inquiry. Journalists searched for new details. Supporters and critics alike attempted to understand how events had escalated so rapidly. The records that first sparked concern were now being discussed as though they represented the beginning of a much larger institutional reckoning. Public reaction was swift and emotional. Some expressed disappointment, believing the controversy threatened to undermine years of charitable work associated with the Foundation. Others argued that decisive action demonstrated accountability and a willingness to confront difficult issues directly. Regardless of where opinions fell, one reality became impossible to ignore. The story had captured public attention on a massive scale. Questions were no longer coming from a handful of concerned observers. They were coming from everywhere. Inside palace circles, the sense of shock reportedly ran even deeper. According to sources, many officials had spent weeks hoping the investigation would conclude before reaching this stage. Instead, the suspension intensified every concern they had hoped to avoid. Discussions reportedly became increasingly urgent as advisors scrambled to assess the implications. The fear was not only about the immediate controversy, but about the long-term impact on public confidence. The monarchy had weathered crises before, but every new challenge carried its own risks. As the debate intensified, questions about accountability moved to the forefront. People wanted to know who had approved critical decisions. They wanted to know whether warning signs had been overlooked. They wanted to know what safeguards would be implemented moving forward. The demand for answers grew louder by the day, creating enormous pressure on those responsible for managing the response. Meanwhile, Camilla's allies reportedly launched an aggressive effort to contain the fallout. They emphasized the Foundation's accomplishments, highlighted years of charitable contributions, and argued that conclusions should not be reached before all findings were fully examined. Yet their efforts faced a difficult reality. The narrative had already shifted. The controversy was no longer defined by what supporters hoped people would remember. It was being defined by the questions that remained unanswered. Within royal households, the scandal reportedly dominated nearly every major discussion. Conversations that once focused on future initiatives now revolved around crisis management. Advisors debated next steps. Senior figures weighed potential consequences. Rumors of further actions, additional reviews, and deeper investigations began circulating with increasing frequency. The suspension, dramatic as it seemed, was not bringing closure. If anything, it was opening an entirely new chapter. Because while the public focused on the shutdown itself, another struggle was quietly unfolding beyond the headlines. Struggle involving power, influence, accountability, and the future direction of the monarchy. And according to those closest to the situation, the most consequential battles had yet to begin. Yet the fallout from the shutdown was only one part of a much larger battle unfolding behind the scenes. Long after the headlines fade, the consequences of this extraordinary controversy may continue shaping the monarchy's future. Because at its core, this was never just about a charity foundation. It was about trust. As the immediate shock began to settle, a deeper conversation emerged across royal circles, among commentators, and within the public itself. The controversy had started with financial questions. expanded into an investigation, and ultimately resulted in a crisis that reached the highest levels of the institution. Yet the lasting significance of the story was not found in spreadsheets, reports, or emergency meetings. It was found in what those events revealed about accountability. For many observers, the controversy became a symbol of a larger challenge facing the modern monarchy: how to preserve public confidence while navigating the pressures, expectations, and scrutiny that come with immense visibility. The debate surrounding royal accountability quickly intensified. Supporters of stronger oversight argued that institutions earn trust not by avoiding difficult questions, but by confronting them directly. Critics insisted that greater transparency would be essential moving forward. Others worried that the controversy risked overshadowing years of charitable work and public face service. What united nearly everyone, however, was the recognition that trust had become the central issue. The public was no longer asking only what happened. They were asking how the monarchy intended to prevent similar controversies from emerging in the future. Throughout the crisis, Princess Anne emerged as one of the most significant figures in the unfolding story. To her supporters, she became a symbol of institutional integrity, someone willing to place duty above personal relationships when difficult decisions had to be made. Her determination reportedly earned admiration from those who believed accountability should apply universally, regardless of status or position. Yet her role also highlighted the painful reality that protecting an institution sometimes requires confronting uncomfortable truths. What appeared from the outside to be a battle over records and procedures was, in many ways, a struggle over the values the monarchy wished to project to the nation. Meanwhile, public confidence remained an ongoing concern. Trust can take decades to build and only moments to weaken. Palace officials reportedly understood that restoring confidence would require more than statements and reassurances. It would require action, calls for stronger oversight, more rigorous governance structures, and greater transparency reportedly grew louder with every passing week. The controversy had exposed vulnerabilities that many believed could no longer be ignored. For Camilla, the questions surrounding her legacy may prove difficult to escape. Regardless of how history ultimately judges the controversy, the foundation's troubles became intertwined with her public image in ways few could have predicted. Years of achievements now risked being viewed through the lens of a single crisis. The contrast was striking. What once appeared to be a source of strength had become a source of scrutiny. And in the world of public life, perceptions often linger long after official investigations conclude. The royal family now faces challenges that extend beyond this particular controversy. Questions about governance, responsibility, and institutional trust are unlikely to disappear. New expectations have emerged. Public demands have evolved. The monarchy must adapt while preserving the traditions that define it. That balancing act may become one of the defining tests of the years ahead. And perhaps that is why the future remains so uncertain. The controversy may have reached a conclusion, but the broader questions it raised continue to echo throughout the institution. What lessons will be learned? What reforms will follow? What hidden pressures still exist beneath the surface? Those questions remain unanswered, leaving the monarchy standing at a crossroads between tradition and transformation. The headlines will eventually fade. The public attention will move elsewhere. But the impact of this moment may endure far longer than anyone expected, shaping decisions, relationships, and reputations for years to come. And as the palace attempts to restore confidence, one question still hangs over everything. What other secrets remain hidden behind royal walls? Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.